Welcome back everyone to the Democracy is a Joke mini-series. In part 1 we discussed some of the circumstances why someone might think that in our democratic system one side is supposed to win. Well, there have been some developments and some things I didn't cover last time, which I would like to start the video with before I go into the reasons why this is the state of democracy. So, on to the news. Beginning with Hungary, there have been new developments above what I mentioned in the previous video. And on essentially the same issue as well. This time the EU Parliament members want to remove Hungary's voting rights entirely, essentially for wanting to continue economic ties and no longer antagonizing Russia. They describe that as a security concern. So the country which told you that it sees expanding NATO influence as antagonism against itself, you wanting to not expand the membership to other countries, that is somehow a security concern. Now, I would class a security concern something like revealing the location of troops or a location of resources which is not made available to the public, but some EU members have different opinions of me. I mean, seriously, look at the expansion of NATO and imagine that you are Russia. The part of the world from which your most populated area was invaded 3 times in the last 2 centuries forms a military alliance which deliberately excludes you. Are you happy about that? Now, I do not believe that Russia's influence on Europe is something to be desired, but I also understand basic geopolitics. Speaking of basic geopolitics, the second news is that J.D. Vance, the new Vice President of the United States, went to a security conference where it reminded the leaders of Europe to keep what makes Europe free.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America. Now, I was struck that a former European commissioner went on television recently and sounded delighted that the Romanian government had just annulled an entire election. Now, within living memory of many of you in this room, the Cold War positioned defenders of democracy against much more tyrannical forces on this continent. And consider the side in that fight that censored dissidents, that closed churches, that canceled elections. Were they the good guys? Certainly not. And thank God they lost the Cold War. And unfortunately, when I look at Europe today, it's sometimes not so clear what happened to some of the Cold War's winners. I look to Brussels, where EU commissars warn citizens that they intend to shut down social media during times of civil unrest the moment they spot what they've judged to be, quote, hateful content. Or to this very country, where police have carried out raids against citizens suspected of posting anti-feminist comments online as part of, quote, combating misogyny on the internet, a day of action. So I come here today not just with an observation, but with an offer. And just as the Biden administration seemed desperate to silence people for speaking their minds, so the Trump administration will do precisely the opposite, and I hope that we can work together on that.
Almost everyone was very flustered by this speech, and someone even cried.
Let me conclude, and this becomes difficult.
Plus, they held a meeting after, which has been described as promptly agreeing on nothing, which I found pretty funny, but they will probably set some funds for a European army pretty soon. Speaking of the news and the US Vice President, Donald Trump, the US President, had a speech to the Congress, which was pretty good.
Members of the United States Congress, thank you very much. And to my fellow citizens, America is back. To unshackle our economy, I have directed that for every 1 new regulation, 10 old regulations must be eliminated, just like I did in my very successful first term.
I'm not going to react to it right now, but if you're interested in stuff like this, you should know that I regularly premiere my videos and the current record I have is 6 simultaneous viewers. This is with the videos being scheduled and announced a couple of hours in advance. Now when my peak viewers will be 20, which is possible because I make sure that my premiere hours are reasonable for both the US and Europe, when I will have 20 record simultaneous viewers, I will begin taking suggestions on what to react to live, because it's not as fun to be live with 2 or 3 viewers. Now back to Europe and attitudes towards security and war. So, speaking of armies, the reactions of many European politicians and journalists and media actors is basically this.
I don't think we should panic, but I think we are in a hurry. And I think we have been in a hurry for 3 years, but now we really have to scale up and to speed up because Russia and Putin is not only threatening Ukraine, but all of us. And we have to be able to defend ourselves. My idea about Ukraine is the same as it has been now for 3 years, that they have to win this war. And if we allow Russia to win the war, I'm sorry to say it directly to all of you, he will continue and they will continue. And maybe we will even give them a better situation than today, because if we end this war now with some kind of a frozen conflict, a ceasefire, it will give Russia the possibility to return to Russia, to mobilize more funds, people, and maybe to attack another country in Europe.
Thank you, Miss Danish Prime Minister. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention, and I forgot about last time, is that the trend in the elections, which I've shown in a previous video, will likely be continued, so I would want you to pay attention to the next elections. The most recent one should be somewhere in May, which is for Poland. Let's see what happens there, if anything. And with that, I welcome you to another Lessons in Political Maturity special. Why does democracy feel impossible? Last time we ended on the concept of the big bad, that wrong choice, that decision which is not democratically allowable. And we've seen how it doesn't have to make sense. Besides the example I given then, there are examples in other countries, such as Giorgia Meloni, who is again one of these politicians which is declared to be far-right neo-fascist, when in fact it's more than sufficient to describe her as a neoliberal. Both her strong Zionism and support for NATO are two elements which stand strongly against the known narrative about neo-fascists. But what is this narrative of a big bad really supposed to do? What does it accomplish? Let's start by looking at those who use it. And it should be no surprise when I say that those who use it most these days are on the left. It's a favorite accusation, far-right, fascist, to accuse everyone, from conservatives to libertarians, to basically anyone who doesn't fully embrace everything that the left currently supports. And, worse than that, wants the left to walk back its policies and pursue a different course of action. And these are unlike the equivalent accusations which come from the right of far left or communist. At the very least, those are usually directed at people who either are outright communist, are sympathetic to their ideals, or were trained by people who are sympathetic to those ideals. So then what does the narrative of a big bad help justify? Well, if the opponent is that bad, that, to some, justifies the actions taken against him. So if we were to take this approach, then our actions would be justified because we're preventing something so much worse. I'm going to give some examples on screen and you're free to read them. I will also go through some of them in a little bit. But this mentality of the big bad and what it justifies is where the phrase "the left is usually more guilty of what it accuses the right than the right" is. And if the left believes its own actions to be so good and the actions of its opponents to be so bad, that forms the mentality stating that they are made of love and we are made of hate. And once this mindset is in place, the chances of changing it through argument are infinitesimal. And no matter what examples you give, you will probably not convince anyone because they think that what they do is justified. There will almost never be a moment of reflection, even if you point out that this mindset led them to mock children, or to embrace election conspiracies after they spent years denying them, or to ignore attitudes against certain races because only some forms of racism matter, or the dehumanization of their opponents, or the celebration of violence against them, or simply pointing out that given what those people do, describing them in a certain way doesn't make any sense. They allow themselves misrepresentation, dehumanizing language, advocacy for violence, because after all what they do is not hypocrisy, it's hierarchy. They're simply allow themselves to do it because they decided they will. In this mindset, even people defending themselves from them is still somehow twisted into an attack on them. If anything, the left's attitude, rather than being compassion, can better be described as acting gently and completely innocent when it doesn't have any power, and acting with complete brutality and ruthless determination when it does have power. Anyone paying attention knows that this narrative of the left is made of love and the right is made of hate is false. We even have studies coming out every couple of months showing in various ways how leftists view the right way more unfavorably, way more hatefully than the right sees them. The right sees the left in most cases as naive, and the left sees the right as evil. And as such, it tries to destroy both it and everything which keeps its constancy. Anything that's not transgressive, anything which wants to build a stable order, is seen as fascism. Once entrenched, and it is entrenched, the power structure makes good use of it, because it makes it, Chapter 3, managed and accepted. It is in democratic interest for everyone to be involved in the political process, and as such, it is in democratic interest for everyone to want to participate in the political process. And what better way it is to do is to make people think that each election is crucial. As such, the narrative of the big bad finds its place in democracy. But you know what else is useful? What if the big bad wasn't dangerous? What if it was all, or in its vast majority, an exaggeration? What if the political system was not threatened by the big bad? What would happen then? If the political system was not threatened by the big bad, then it would be, for the most part, in control of the situation, and as such, it can simply guide it. But how do you convince the people to believe this? Democracy sells itself as being an enlightened way of approaching politics, above the violence and the treachery and the force used in power politics. As such, the way it solves its problem is through diplomacy, through discussion. All you need to do to enact policies is to change people's minds, and because politics is being perceived as a bottom-up movement, if enough people believe the correct things, then politicians and the political class as a whole will be held accountable and the policy changes will be implemented. This forms the system of the endless conversation. The idea that if a topic has been discussed and debated and we get our guy in charge, that means that the topic has been basically dealt with and the problem is about to be solved. The follow-up is also important, and I will be discussing it in a minute, but with this foundation, one of the most important political goals is defending free speech. Any platform which first and foremost yearns for a return to normalcy, for a return to the 90s, like The Independent, Trigonometry, Unheard, GB News, any free speech convention, and basically anyone who believes anything similar to if you kill your enemies, they win because you didn't defeat them in the marketplace of ideas. A great example of this is Christopher Rufo, who exposed a scandal of corruption in academia at Harvard, and two things followed from that controversy. One is that the person in question stepped down but still continued to work in a lesser position, and two, because this conflict was during a time when the left was in the spotlight during a time of racial tensions because of the Israel-Palestine conflict. What many people, including himself, took out of it is that the problem with the left and its identity politics is the fact that it doesn't live up enough to the civil rights Martin Luther King version of civics. And what we need is to go back to the 90s, when what the liberals wanted was perfectly good and everything was working fine. The same situation as in the free speech debate, and go back to the norms about race in the 90s, are present in the LGB without the T discussion. Now, the astute among you may realize that there is a problem with this. Mainly that if you rewind the clock, then the way it will continue is in the exact same direction, and you will deal with the problem again. This is the opposite problem of what the left does. The left tries solutions which are never going to work, and it's clear that they're never going to work when they're proposed, and then they blame white supremacy or capitalism or patriarchy for their own failures. Well, it's less opposite, it's more mirrored. It's the same problem going in the other direction. With these problems and with these solutions, the power structure can deal with. Because if it is pushed back, then it can just try them again later under a different name. This is a strategy which I call rebranding, A rose by any other name is still a rose. And its most current iteration is putting the woke away. Many companies supported causes which are woke, or what the left currently supports. Well, when they removed their support for those kinds of policies, they consolidated a little bit of power, and nothing really stops them from trying again the same thing later, because every time it is advertised as just basic decency. And it's consistent with the liberalism which both parties support. Currently, the entirety of the political spectrum is various forms of liberalism, and all the political parties are various flavors of that. Now, the fact that the power structure knows how to deal with all of these circumstances which come out of the political process is called containment. Containment is the stage in which the power structure wants you to be at. Someone being containment doesn't mean that that person aligns oneself with the status quo. It just means that the status quo knows how to deal with that person, how to make sure that the influence that person has isn't great. That at most what that person will do is change the conversation. The strength of the power structure is not in the control of events. That is not what containment is about. It's in the framing of events. So take every conspiracy theory about a shadowy cabal controlling the state that you believe in or you have heard of, and treat it as if only 1% of that is true and the other 99% happens through wasting time, through wasting your time, to getting you to watch the news, constantly repeating the same talking points, but attached to new faces, and debate fiercely as to whether the blue suit or the red suit or the green suit is the person who should win. This technique of which suit do you support is called the two-story state. When you are presented with one narrative and you do not like it, you might reject it in its entirety and seek something different. But when you have two narratives presented to you and you reject one of them, a great temptation would be to endorse the other. And if all of these narratives are given to you because they're not threatening, then the system is going to continue as it is. And this is how it works with political parties. This is most clear in the American system, which has two political parties. But the European system isn't dealing any better. The system knows how to deal with those parties as well. Even Trump is containment. Yes, he is anti-establishment, but given his first administration, the establishment knows how he will act like, mostly. And we can tell that he is containment because his victory was being predicted 10 months in advance. The various investors and middle to high managers knew they need to prepare for him and roughly how to do it. The issue of changing parties became merely a matter of management. That is why the whole system is called the managerial state. Think of what Trump's actions are so far. He supports this DOGE initiative, the Department of Government Efficiency, and what does that do? It removes bloat, which can of course be used to realize good things more easily, but at the same time, it allows systems which are not as good to perpetuate themselves further. In managerialism, both decisions are managed and people are managed. The way people are managed is a little bit more profound than just saying that human resources departments exist. No, you can see the mentality of managing people on multiple levels by looking at the kind of person pushed as compatible with the power structure. The institutional structure of managing people is called the therapeutic state. In its most innocuous form, it begins with the response to the question, what makes democracy so good? The answer we're going to get will most of the time contain the description of the kind of person which is compatible with democracy. Something about a well-educated voter who puts civic interests above all and isn't fooled by populist rhetoric. Then you'll be told about how politicians are held accountable by the will of the people or they'll no longer be in office, and this ensures that the policies that people want will be implemented. Then if you point out that politicians usually are not held accountable and the policies people want are not being implemented, then you'll probably get that person who have a reset and just go back to, but democracy is the best system we ever came up with. At higher levels in the therapeutic state, you get positions like certain political stances are a form of mental illness. They're not compatible with a democratic society and our values. Things like nationalism is an archaic idea, and X thing, X being usually a thing being objected to, X is a normal part of life living in a modern society or in a major city. And the third level of the therapeutic state is the one which judges people based on how easy they make the maintenance of the system. This is both seen in the educational system being by the Prussian model, which promotes obedience, and in the MAID system, or medically assisted dying, which is the ultimate form of judging the healthcare provision based on the cost it poses on the system. This therapeutic approach to people that they just need to be managed into the correct type of person is exactly why my motto for my series Which Way Modern Man is Machines are managed, life is cultivated. So, which way, modern man? More of that series will be released on my channel in the future, and we will discuss countermeasures to ways in which we are dependent on the system. Now, we've discussed managerialism's approach to people through the therapeutic state, but I've also said that it has an approach to policy. That happens in two ways, both of which we've partly discussed. First is the two-story state, which most desires two parties which are extremely similar, yet very polarized. That way, they can both promise change and nothing happens. It is actually even better for such a system if, when one party is in power, it implements the unpopular policies with the other party. Part of how that happens is because the other party is not interested in the unpopular policies of the other, so it will not notice when its own party pushes for them. And these unpopular policies usually serve more concentration of power, making the politicians do less and be rewarded for more, and at best, just undoing some superficial aspect of the policies of the other party. No party's voter base wants digital ID, but under different names using rebranding, digital ID gets passed. The environment is important, but the only green legislation which gets passed are the ones which more regulate and further control the energy sector. No native population wants more migration, but a more diverse population makes it harder to unionize, so more migration gets passed. And migration is a self-justifying phenomenon. For example, you have too many migrants. That calls for more housing being built. However, the resources allocated for more housing are too little, so the housing is subpar, which in turn results in lower living conditions and more accidents happening in the spaces reserved for migrants and refugees. And that causes the rhetoric of we've failed those we had a responsibility towards, so we have to take in more of them. Alternatively, our population is too aging and our social care services cannot keep up, or we need them to grow the economy. But then you look at how they are less economically productive than the natives, so that justifies more workers to come to increase the economy even more. This process of both parties being less and less represented and the power accumulated mainly to serve the political class itself is what I have called the draining process, which, if you want to find out more about it, you could start watching Lessons in Political Maturity 1, the left's learning problem, from the beginning, and you will find it in chapter 1. This relates nicely to the second part of the endless conversation and containment, because these decisions which help the power apparatus are the ones which it keeps trying to pass. Meanwhile, the politicians elected bottom up, which are within the overtone window, just push for their policies a little bit, and over the course of several months, just slowly shifting the overtone window. Never a lot, and the only exception for policies are those which have been decided already, and now we can't change them. We can't do anything about them, regardless of the opinion of the voting population. And anyway, why does it matter anyway? It is too late to stop, and plus it's a good thing anyway. Who cares that we said that it's not happening? This is the new reality we have to accept. Now, as you have noticed, the video is coming to an end, but I still haven't addressed solutions to this condition. That, together with the ultimate form of the power structure, will come in part 3. I have used this part to quickly run you through most of the necessary notions you may need to understand the current managerial and democratic system. I have covered little over a dozen notions within about 15 minutes because I'm trying to save you time. Every single one of these notions which I presented, either some people in the distant right have written books about it, or there are dozens of hours of content for each. You are welcome to research them on your own, but this was a crash course to see how neatly they fit together, and how democratic logic is being used to justify from the top, not from the masses, all of this situation. How almost everyone is captured, and what prevents them from seeing things as they are. I am willing to bet that the vast majority of the notions I presented to you in this video are already familiar with you, because you are surrounded by these kinds of events and these kind of justifications. The story does, however, run a little deeper, and I will present that part alongside with the solution in part 3. If you appreciate what I'm doing, please, at the very least, like the video, subscribe if you're not, watch my other content, some of which is not strictly political, and please, if you can afford, support me on Entropy. I'll be answering questions and with enough supporters making exclusive videos only for donors. Now, as you probably noticed, many problems which I've presented have solutions which are in development. However, it takes a lot of time and effort to make these videos, to research, to script and to compile them into an easily digestible form. And I need your support to make this channel sustainable. But until next time, I will leave you with the motto of the Lessons in Political Maturity series. Have a nice week and remember that
we fight for our children's children, so they will not carry these marks.